I've lived 58 winters on this land, and I can tell a storm's intentions by the way the horses breathe. That night, their breath came fast and shallow, like they were trying to pull the air past something invisible. The weather radio had been quiet all afternoon. Clear skies, a chill breeze, the usual Montana evening. But around 9, the wind turned metallic and the pasture fence began to hum as if the whole valley were a tuning fork struck by an unseen hand. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee and felt the temperature fall 10 degrees in one sigh. The stars looked wrong, too many of them, and too still, as if a painter had pinned them one by one and forgotten the sky was supposed to move. When the first flash came, it wasn't lightning. Lightning cracks, this folded. The dark pressed in, then peeled back in layers, and in the strip of wheat behind my east barn, a coin blue light dropped out of nothing, silent and heavy, the way a secret falls between people who love each other and don't know how to speak. I set the coffee down and didn't hear it land. The horses screamed, not the panicked chatter they give when a coyote noses the fence. This was deeper, older. I grabbed the lantern, shrugged into my jacket, and took the back steps 2 at a time. My knee complained, the one that never healed right after the ice storm of '09. I told myself I was chasing off a drone, a stray weather balloon, anything with a manufacturer and a warranty. The path down to the barns is muscle memory by now, but that night my boot prints went a little sideways, as if the ground weren't committed to being under me. Halfway down the slope, my lantern popped and died. The darkness that replaced it wasn't empty. It was dense, like the inside of a closed eye. And yet I could see the field perfectly because the light in the wheat wasn't lighting the wheat. It was lighting me. A blue that wasn't color so much as temperature, cold, clean, almost medicinal, pushed against my face and hands. The stalks bowed away from it, and the air carried a smell I've only ever known once before. The antiseptic tang of a hospital elevator the night my wife left me alone with a hallway and a doctor who wouldn't meet my eyes. "Hey," I called, because silence is a lawbreaker and I've always believed in laws. "Who's there?" No one answered, but the light tightened, drew itself into a sphere the size of a truck tire, and hovered shoulder-high, humming the way power lines do in February. The wheat around it lay down, as if flattened by a careful palm. I took another step and felt my molars ring. Then the sphere stuttered, 3 quick pulses like a heartbeat trying to remember its job, and dropped into the crop with a soft, wet sound, as if it had fallen through a membrane I couldn't see. I ran the last yards. The lantern was dead weight in my hand, but I kept it because letting it go would have meant letting go of a world where lanterns are enough. The blue had gone diffuse, a leak of light bleeding between the stalks. I parted them and found a hollow where wheat had been pressed outward in a perfect circle. In the center lay a shape that didn't belong to any animal I knew. It was not machine, not entirely. It had the suggestion of ribs, the idea of limbs. Its surface, skin, metal, caught the light like fog catches moonlight, not reflecting it so much as accepting it. It was small. That surprised me. Not a giant, not some nightmare out of a comic book. The length of a man curled to sleep, thin as a shadow. I told myself it was a trick of sleep deprivation. I told myself a lot of things. Then it moved. Just a tremor along its side, the faintest lift and fall, as if trying to remember how breathing works here. "Easy," I said, because I didn't know what else to say. My voice sounded like it was coming from behind my shoulder. "Easy." A sound flickered against my skull, a tone more than a note, like a tuning pitch in an empty church. It wasn't in my ears. It was in the place I keep the names of the dead. It held there, steady, and with it came a feeling I hadn't met in years. Not terror, not awe, permission. As if something had looked at me and decided I was allowed to be here. I knelt without deciding to. The ground was oddly warm, as if the day's sun had been banked under it. Close up, the thing's surface wasn't smooth. It was made of countless tiny plates, overlapping like scales. each one moving a fraction out of step with the next. Where a face might have been, there was a suggestion of features, soft and unfinished like wet clay, right before a sculptor's last pass. The place that should have been eyes was a darkness so gentle it felt like mercy. "I'm going to help you," I heard myself say. "If you understand me, blink, or do something." It didn't blink. Instead, the tone behind my thoughts rose half a step, then settled. My left hand lifted on its own, palm open, like I was showing it I had nothing to hide. I remembered the night Ruth took her last breath, the way her fingers had sought mine, the way the world had narrowed to the space between our hands. Grief came like a wave and broke without sound. The thing shivered. The blue throbbed once, softer now, and the metal skin under my palm grew warmer, almost human. I don't know what rights or wrongs apply when the sky bends and puts a stranger in your wheat. I know what a winter will do to something alone. I know what kindness is worth when there's no one there to witness it. I slid my arms under the shape. It was impossibly light, a rumor given weight. Somewhere above us, the stars remembered how to move. I stood, legs shaking, and turned toward the house. The horses had gone quiet. The fence had stopped singing. Behind me, in the circle of laid-down wheat, the last of the blue sank into the earth and was gone. 7 days, the tone said, not a word, but a number laid gently against my mind. I didn't answer. I carried the stranger to my cellar, and with each step, the world I knew loosened its grip, one finger at a time. I didn't switch on the overhead bulb. Habit, maybe, or superstition, like if I kept the light off, I could keep the world I knew from seeing what I was about to do. The cellar breathed cool and damp, carrying the old smells of apples that had never quite left, and the iron tang of tools I sharpened every fall. I eased the stranger onto my workbench blanket and pulled the chain on a single lamp clamped to the joist. Its narrow cone cut the darkness into a small, survivable country. Up close, there was no denying it. What I'd carried was not built for this gravity or this air. The plates along its side rose and fell in hitching rhythms, as if the timing belt of a living thing were slipping. The area that might have been a chest bore a faint oval bruise of dimmer blue, pulsing just a fraction too slow. A mechanic's brain lives in my hands. Fix it, stabilize it, make it hold together long enough to matter. I laid out what I had. Clean towels, the tin of salve I use for cracked hooves, a mason jar of boiled water, a spool of fishing line I didn't expect to use but couldn't put away. The inventory steadied me. I can do this, I told myself, not understand it, just do it. When I touched the bruise with the back of my fingers, the air hummed and the cellar's shadows leaned in. The tone from the field returned, low, precise, like a tuning fork on the bone behind my ear. My breath shortened. "If you can hear me," I said, "I'm going to try to help. I don't know how, but I'm trying." It answered with a soft, downward slide of sound, a yes without syllables. I wet a cloth and dabbed at the fine dust that clung to the plates, more like pollen than soil. The dust lifted and turned the water a faint silver. Beneath it, the plates flexed easier, the pulse gathering strength. The not-quite face tilted toward my hand. The darkness where eyes should have been wasn't empty. It had a texture, like looking into deep water lit from within. It didn't stare. It regarded. There's a difference. The tone rose again. 2 notes this time, and I felt, this is the only word I have, meaning. It wasn't language. It was a clean idea placed gently in my head. Concealment. The image arrived whole. My cellar door as seen from the yard, the way morning light creases the gaps in the planks, the angle a deputy would approach if he thought I was hiding a wounded elk. My heart banged once, hard. "All right," I said. "All right." I moved through the house on autopilot. I stuffed a towel in the door crack, drew the kitchen curtains, killed the porch light I normally leave on for coyotes and memories. I put the tractor in front of the barn, hood up, so anyone passing would think my evening ended with a stubborn engine. In the mudroom, I stared a long time at the phone. Every rule of decent citizenship ran through my head like railroad cars. Report a crash. Call a doctor. Don't harbor what you don't understand. Then Ruth's voice came back, the last time we spoke when she could still make sentences. Some things you keep alive first, you make sense of them later. I set the phone down. Back in the cellar, the stranger had lifted a hand or something like one, not with fingers exactly, but with intent. The air around that limb looked denser, as if the light were wading through it. The tone shifted to a smaller, careful interval. I felt it as a question. Pain? I shook my head, maybe to say I was fine, maybe to keep the world from tipping. You? I asked, and pointed to the bruise. A ripple traveled the plates, and the blue in the oval steadied. The sense that came was simple as weather, will hold. Relief made my knees unreliable. I sat on the bottom step and tried to breathe the way they teach you before they stop resuscitating the person you love. Minutes, hours, time loosened. Every so often the tone would brush my thoughts with a wordless check-in, and I'd answer without words, the way you answer a baby's night cry by standing in the doorway so they know the world hasn't vanished. At some point I realized I was cold and pulled on Ruth's old cardigan, the one I never managed to donate. The sleeves hung too short on me and made me look like a scarecrow. The stranger watched, if watching is what it was doing, and the tone gave a small, falling note that felt like recognition or thanks, or both. 7 days, I said, speaking the number aloud as if a contract needed a voice to make it real. You said 7. The tone touched my mind again, this time laying down something like a map. 7 small stones set in a line across a shallow river, a path designed for careful feet. Between the stones ran a current I knew without having seen, a pull strong enough to take a man if he misjudged once. The map dissolved, leaving only the knowledge, not a countdown, a crossing. I made rules because rules keep the floor from giving way. Rule 1, door bolted, curtains drawn. Rule 2, no phone calls. Rule 3, if anyone comes by, I'm mending the tractor and the cellar is empty. Rule 4, water every hour, check the blue. Rule 5, speak calmly, even when the voice is in my head and the cellar air moves like it's breathing with us. Sometime near dawn, a thin band of grey showed at the high window and turned the dust motes into a slow parade. The stranger's breathing, if that's what it was, had settled into a rhythm I could have set a watch by. I got up, filled the kettle, and when the steam rose I realized I was making 2 cups out of habit, mine and hers. I laughed once, a sound that didn't know what emotion it belonged to, and poured just one. Before I took a sip, the tone came again, softer than steam, placing a new idea where the others had gone. Listen, not to it, to everything. I turned my head. The house ticked and sighed in its old bones. The wind combed the poplars. Far off on the highway, a truck announced itself and faded. Beneath it all, somewhere between floor and earth, a frequency I'd never noticed before was threading through the cellar like a distant choir holding a single note. It had been there my whole life, maybe. I just hadn't had permission to hear it. Okay, I said, and felt the word go into the room and come back less alone. 7 days. I'll keep you safe. The tone answered with a barely there chord, agreement braided with something humbler. Trust, I thought, and then corrected myself. Not trust. A small, deliberate risk. I set the cup down, squared the blanket around the stranger, and made a place for the unknown in my house. Morning inched down the cellar wall, a thin coin of light edging across the concrete like it was paying a toll to pass. I'd slept in the chair, sleep the way a sentry sleeps, one eye on the door my back refused to turn to. The stranger lay where I'd left it, The blue bruise no longer a warning light, but a steady beacon, as if the room had learned to breathe in its tempo. I listened for the horses, for the kind of silence that means trouble, for the neighbor's ancient F-150 with the muffler that makes it sound like a bad idea. All ordinary. The world was pretending not to notice. "Can you understand me?" I asked, not expecting an answer so much as offering the question a seat at the table. The tone arrived. A bell pitched for one listener. It slid up a hair, then down like a hand smoothing linen. Meaning followed, not in words, but in the way a scent drags a memory behind it. Yes. The yes carried more than agreement. It carried a shape, and the shape opened. Not a translator, but a bridge. I felt it locate the parts of me that could carry weight and the parts that couldn't, the way a seasoned carpenter tests a floor with a heel. "Who are you?" I tried next, and the question looked ridiculous, hanging in the air. If I'd asked a mountain its name, I would have sounded the same. A ripple passed under its plates. The tone cupped my mind and placed something there, a black river at night, stars braided in its surface, a small craft moving without oars. Above, a sky that wasn't ours, more crowded, more intimate. Along the banks, structures like vertebrae gleamed with a soft life. The river was not water, not entirely. It was a current, a path, a practice. The craft was not a vehicle, it was a choice traveling. When the image loosened its hold, I was left with the truth the picture had been hired to carry. A traveler, not a soldier, not a conqueror, one who goes and returns on behalf of others. "Why me?" I asked, immediately regretting the nakedness of it. The tone considered. That was new, to feel a pause that wasn't empty. Then a smaller image, a door in a fence line, cut by a previous owner and mended a dozen times. Cattle had learned the habit of it generations back. Even after I patched it, they lingered there when storms were coming out of memory. The stranger set that door gently inside me, because you keep doors from becoming walls. I couldn't decide whether to cry or laugh at the accuracy of being seen. I chose neither. "You said 7 days," I reminded it. "What happens at the end?" A cord this time, thin and layered, like wire drawn through flame. The cellar air thickened just enough that I felt it in my teeth. The idea arrived harder, less forgiving. Interval. Between where it belonged and where it was now lay a pattern that opened only on a cadence. Cross too early or too late, and the river would turn a traveler into debris. I pictured a train I couldn't see, crossing a bridge I didn't know was above me. The schedule didn't care how I felt. It cared whether I moved at the right moment. "Food? Water?" I asked, reaching for easier problems. "Do you need—" I stopped because the plates along its side shifted in an unmistakable attempt to sit. "Hold on," I said, and the country of my fear gave way to the province where I'm useful. I rolled the blanket into a wedge and tucked it beneath what I hoped was a shoulder. "Better?" The answer wasn't a word or a picture. It was warmth, the room's temperature adjusting by a single kind degree. Gratitude has always been my undoing. It makes me brave. "You stay," I heard myself say, like I say to a spooked colt. "I'll handle the outside." I went up and moved through the checklist I'd invented in the dark. I fed the horses, pretended to tinker with the tractor, left footprints where a curious eye would expect a morning to have passed. At the mailbox, I forced my hand to collect the weekly circulars addressed to resident, because not doing so would be the louder announcement. The sky had the flat look it gets in March, when winter pretends the sun is a rumor. By the time I returned, the quiet in the house had learned my name. Back in the cellar, the stranger had turned its face toward the light strip. The shadow that stood in for features seemed deeper, as if it had gathered what day it could. I brought water in a shallow pan and set it nearby. "I don't know what you take," I said. "So I brought what I'd offer a life I don't understand." The tone came low, a brush of graphite across paper. The idea that formed belonged to neither of us but to the overlap. Exchange, not consumption, not fuel, the way heat leaves coffee and enters hands on a cold morning. The room learned a little more warmth. I felt something leave me, small, not stolen, given without expense, and something return, a steadier rhythm under my ribs. "What do I call you?" I asked, because naming is a handle and I needed one. The river image returned, but altered. This time I was standing on the bank, and the current spoke in stones rather than water. The syllables that rose weren't pronounceable. Their edges were for mouths I didn't have. The stranger understood that and simplified. It placed a single clean sound inside me, the chime of a glass tapped once by a ringed hand. Not a name, the idea clarified. A reminder. I tried to repeat it and produced only air. The tone answered with a small lift that felt like a smile. Footsteps crossed my porch. The word footsteps reached me 2 beats before the sound did, the way thunder makes you think lightning again. 2. Light. Not a deputy. Not the kid who drops off feed, he bounds like a dog. I set my cup down without noise and moved to the stairs. The stranger's tone thinned to a filament and wrapped around the thought concealment again. But this time, it carried urgency, like a hand at the small of my back, guiding me faster than dignity allows. "Don't move," I whispered, absurd even as I said it. I blew out the cellar lamp. The dark rushed back to claim the corners. The high window admitted a pale sheet of day, enough to turn the stranger into a rumor among shapes. I closed the cellar door soft and stood in the kitchen, heart objecting, mind suddenly empty of plans. A knock, 3 polite taps. Whoever stood outside believed the world was still ordinary. I pressed my palm flat against the wood and, without meaning to, reached for the tone. It met me halfway. Into the tight space behind my forehead, it set a single, spare directive. Choose, not between right and wrong, between the morning I'd been living and the river that had reached my door. I opened the door. I opened the door to find Mrs. Keating holding a pie like a warrant. She's the kind of neighbor who believes civilization fails one courtesy at a time, and she refuses to be present at the crime. Her grey hair was tucked under a wool cap, and her eyes did that quick inventory people do when they smell smoke but can't locate the fire. "Morning, Hank," she said, though it was closer to noon. "Brought you a blueberry. Costco, but I put it on my plate so it counts." She lifted it a fraction, as if to prove it had moral weight, and I remembered to be a person. "You're a saint," I said, stepping aside. The cellar door was behind me, shut and breathing like a wall that wished it were a door. I moved just enough to block her sightline. She stepped in, bringing with her the weather and that faint scent of cold laundry. "Saw your tractor hood up," she said. "Figured you could use sugar." "Stubborn carb," I lied. "Everything's stubborn this week." Her gaze snagged on the mudroom, the boots not where boots should be, the towel stuffed against the cellar jam like a bandage. "You expecting a flood?" "Draft," I said too quickly. "Mouse problem. I'm running a line of traps." "Mice don't cause drafts," she said mildly. She set the pie on the counter and took a long, slow look at my kitchen. Mrs. Keating has a gift for silence that turns other people into radios. "You look tired." I slept in the chair. "That explains the face. Coffee?" "I've got it," I said, moving to the stove because movement felt like control. The kettle was still warm from earlier. My hands were not. She talked about normal things in the voice of a lighthouse, the post office, cutting hours, a coyote too brave for its own blood, her son in Billings, who wanted her to sell the place and move into something called a community. I listened like a man memorizing a map he'll never get to use. Beneath the talk, my attention leaned hard toward the cellar. The stranger's tone had gone thin when I closed the door, a wire pulled tight to keep a bridge from singing. I didn't dare reach for it now. A slip would be louder than any word. "You hear anything odd last night?" she asked, too casually. "Lights, maybe?" The steam rattled the lid. Storm made the fence hum, I said. Horses were jumpy. Horses know things, she said. She watched me pour coffee with the benign suspicion of a mother at a science fair. Power flickered at my place. And there was this... what's the word? She rotated a hand in the air. Taste. In the wind. Like a penny on the tongue. I thought of the field lit up like a wound. Barometric shift, I said. Happens. She didn't argue. She took the mug and wrapped both hands around it the way pilgrims hold relics. Sheriff drove by around daybreak, she added. Said a couple folks called about a blue glow. Kids with drones, probably. Said he might make a round. Probably, I said. My voice came out steady, which felt like a small miracle. Kids. We stood there, two old acquaintances on the edge of a cliff, pretending it was a porch. The pie cooled. The kettle quieted. The house breathed, and the cellar waited. I needed her to leave, and I needed her not to feel pushed. People remember how you usher them out when they're deciding whether to come back with questions. You should take a slice, I said, for the road. She smiled the way people smile when they recognize kindness wearing bribery's coat and decide not to call the police. You first, she said. I'll watch. I cut two thin wedges, the knife scraping porcelain like a reprimand. The first bite had no taste. The second reminded me that sweetness exists whether or not we're qualified to accept it. I set the plates down and made a show of enjoying being alive. She followed suit. For a moment, a very small one, I felt the world tilt back toward ordinary, and I saw what it might cost to let it. The sound came then, a soft, settling thump from beneath us. Nothing dramatic, a house noise, the kind old lumber makes when it remembers a winter, except my body knew better. The hair on my arms lit like grass in static. Mrs. Keating's eyes flicked to the floor. Still got that mouse problem? She asked. Traps, I said. Sometimes they snap on their own. Sometimes they don't. I had a choice. The stranger's directive from the door slid back into place. Choose, not a verdict, an alignment. I could lie deeper, build higher, let walls grow where doors once were. Or I could make a smaller, riskier move, open a window just wide enough for fresh air and trouble. Keating, I said, lowering my voice as if a confession had to be kept from the furniture. Can I ask you a favor? Her eyebrows climbed. That sentence is a coupon for suspicion. If the sheriff comes around, you didn't see anything at my place last night, and if you did, it was me being clumsy with the generator. I don't want deputies tromping through my cellar like bulls through communion. There it was, the line drawn with a blunt pencil. She studied me as if the answer might be printed on my jacket. Am I covering for something I need to know about? She asked. Something that'll get on my shoes. I'm covering for something that won't survive being stared at, I said. The truth, wearing a coat it could pass in. For a long moment, she was stone in the river. Then she nodded, once, the way people nod at graves. You were good to Ruth, she said, and you helped bury my old dog when I couldn't shovel worth a lick. I owe you 2 quiets. Thank you, I said, and meant it in a way I couldn't spend yet. She finished her coffee, set the mug in my sink without ceremony, and reclaimed her pie as if it were an alibi. At the door, she turned. If whatever you're not telling me bites, scream. I may not run fast, but I drive like a sinner. When she was gone, and the wind reset the screen door in its frame, I stood very still and listened. The house held. The road offered no tires. I opened the cellar and let the dark that had been holding its breath exhale. I'm here, I said into the cool. The tone returned, a thread I could finally touch, gratitude braided with caution. The word that arrived wasn't a word, not really, but it carried the shape of one I understood. Ally. Good, I said, closing us both back inside the choice I'd made. Then we'll need a plan. Trust, I've learned, doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up like weather. Thin at first, then deciding you've earned a proper storm. By the second night, the cellar had stopped feeling like a hiding place and started feeling like a border crossing with no customs agent, just two travelers holding out empty hands. I took the chair again. The stranger rested on the blanket wedge, the blue at its center pulsing a shade steadier than yesterday. The horses had settled, the house ticked. I kept my breathing a little louder than necessary, a signal I learned in hospitals. I'm here, I'm not leaving, the night won't take you by surprise. Ruth used to hum, I said into the cool. Saying her name out loud was like opening a box I usually leave on the high shelf. Not songs, bits of tune she never finished. It made the house feel like it remembered us. The tone answered so softly, I missed it and then felt it in the bones around my ears. A small upward slide, then a settling, a tension made audible. It isn't that it knew Ruth. It's that it knew what a name does to a room. You feed on what? I asked, groping for a question that didn't put it on a dissecting table. Heat? Light? The idea it set in my mind wasn't an answer so much as a functioning example. Two palms facing, not touching, and between them the skin-prickle spring air carries before rain. Between, the idea said, exchange, not take, not give, meet. I set my hands out without thinking, fingers toward the not-quite face, leaving inches of air. The cellar's temperature shifted 1/2 degree, no more, and a fine, singing dryness collected in the space like the memory of static. That's you? I whispered, or that's us? The tone offered a delicate braid of both. The space listened to us, listening to it. If there's a holier feeling, I haven't earned it. We practiced. That's the word that makes sense. I held the air. The stranger shaped it. The blue stayed steady. When my fingers tired, the tone dipped in a way that felt neither scolding nor grateful, noted, and we paused. It was like learning to waltz with a partner who didn't have feet, just perfect timing. Between those small lessons, images came. Not a flood, postcards laid without haste on the kitchen table of my mind, a span of structures the color of low tide, arching like ribs over a plain that wasn't sand, but something that kept the memory of every step. A rain that fell upward into a dark green sky and stung nothing. A room, if room is the word, that turned with no axis, its walls filled with instruments I couldn't name because they measured distances that didn't exist here. In each picture I felt the same quiet ethic: use less than you can, disturb less than you know. You said we're not ready, I said, for you, for the truth. I hated the smallness in my voice, the way men sound when they ask a judge for mercy. Is it because we fight? Because we're careless? The image that landed first was a mirror, not glass, a calm pond you could still drink from. In it, my face, unflattered but not unkind. Behind me, the cellar staircase, the bolt, the towel stuffed in the jam. Over that, another image, a pair of hands cupped around a moth to carry it outside. Over that, another, the same hands closing around a cigarette they couldn't stop lighting. The tone found me and set down a sentence I won't forget because it made no noise. You are not fragile. You are volatile. It wasn't insult. It was diagnosis. I laughed, the half-laugh men make when they've been caught telling the truth by accident. And you? I asked. Fragile? The stranger showed me a structure like a bell made of water, transparent, resonant, beautiful. And then the same bell cracked by a careless voice, not fragile, specific, the word set. I understood. Some things can bear weight only in their shape. Change the shape and you don't break them. You ask them to be something else, and they decline by falling apart. I wrapped my hands around my mug to keep them busy. If you don't want to be seen, I said, why come close at all? A river again, the black current at night, then the smallest of boats touching a pier for heartbeat and gone. Calibration, the thought said. To be neighbors without collision. I thought of fence lines, of the door in the wire someone cut years before I bought this place, of cattle who had learned a habit so well it outlived the reason. The idea settled in my chest like a stone I could carry. Maybe contact wasn't the point. Maybe coexistence was ambitious enough. We kept working. I told it about the parts of Montana that aren't on postcards, the towns that forgot their names, the winter a whole herd went through the ice, the 4 a.m. taste of coffee that knows you by your first name. In return, it let me feel the interval again, the cadence it had mentioned, the schedule not set by clocks. It came through as a pattern I might have mistaken for music if it hadn't kept rearranging my sense of which beat was one. 7 placements in a line that didn't feel straight. I tapped it on the chair arm until my fingers gave up and my brain smiled without my permission. Not countdown, the idea corrected gently. Chord progression. You don't check off a chord, you arrive at it. When my back complained, I stood and stretched. Pins and needles skittered along my left forearm, a ring of warmth the width of a wedding band in a place no ring had ever sat. I rubbed it, embarrassed by nobody's attention. The warmth faded, but the skin remembered. I filed the memory where I keep the ones that matter and are too early to explain. Near midnight, a new image landed. No landscape this time, just a principle dressed as a thing I could lift. A coil the size of my palm, wound tight and clean. Copper, my hands decided before my mind caught up. Around it, a halo the color of thunderheads. The tone sharpened, not harsh, exact. Tomorrow, it said, and placed a fence post in the picture. I saw wire and salt and the taste of pennies on the wind. You need a coil, I translated, which felt like calling a cathedral a building. Copper. And a way to ground it. Agreement touched my thoughts like a nod. The plan unfurled just far enough to be tempting and not far enough to be safe. I could wait for daylight. I could also obey the river's sense of when to step and when to hold still. We'll get it, I said, the word we surprised me by fitting, but not now, not noisy. The tone settled, assent, braided with patience. I turned down the lamp. The room's darkness came back like a slow tide, taking its time to own every corner. The stranger's blue softened, then hovered just above sleep. I took the chair, my spine mediating between worlds, and let my breathing copy the pulse in the room. Before I drifted, the tone placed one last shape where the others had gone. A door that was also a hinge. Tomorrow, it repeated, quieter now, not later, not sooner. And I understood the assignment. We weren't just hiding a traveler. We were rehearsing the smallest possible miracle, leaving a thing exactly as we found it and still calling it changed. Dawn came thin and pewter, a light that didn't so much illuminate as disclose. I dressed in layers the way you do when winter has opinions, slid my gloves into my back pocket and stood at the cellar door longer than necessary. The stranger rested in its careful stillness, blue steady, tone quiet as breath against glass. Tomorrow, it had said, and the calendar in my bones had turned the page. I'll be back before the road remembers my name, I told it. The answering tone was not blessing or command, just a note hung at head height to remind me which door to use. Outside, the world was cold enough to make truth simple. Every sound carried farther than it had any right to. The pasture wore a lace of frost. Wheat stubble winked like cheap jewelry. I took the path along the south fence, boots crunching, and consulted the grocer's list I'd drafted in my head. Copper, wire, a place to ground, words that felt like disguises for something holier. The old irrigation pump near the creek had a coil that might still remember work. Failing that, the junk shed behind the machine shop where retirees store the past in coffee cans and swear it might be useful again. At the first gate, the padlock stuck like a stubborn memory. I breathed on it, the way my father taught me, as if you could persuade metal with warmth. It gave, sulked, opened. The horses lifted their heads in unison, ears pricked, then returned to hay with the shrug of animals who've seen men try things. The fence hummed faintly, no storm song now, just a dry whisper. It set my teeth on edge in a way I recognized from last night's lesson. Somewhere, an interval was approaching and the land was rehearsing. Halfway to the creek, the feeling started, the one I used to get walking hospital corridors at 3 a.m., knowing a doctor was about to step out of a room and change my life with a sentence. Not panic exactly, a tension with its sleeves rolled. I stopped and let my breath leave in one long thread. The air was clean. The silence had weight. When I moved again, I made smaller noises and listened to how the ground answered them. At the pump shed, a door hung by a bias of rust, crooked as a question. The lock had broken years ago. Inside, the kind of order only neglect can make, shelves lined with glass jars full of bolts that had outlived the things they once held together. A coffee can of washers that smelled like rain, a spool of baling wire coiled like a tired snake. Against the back wall, the pump's carcass waited, belt petrified, motor wearing a coat of dust. I pried the housing with a screwdriver and found what I'd come for. A copper coil wound tight and honest, the color of a penny your grandfather kept in his wallet because it had the right year on it. Easy, I told it, which was ridiculous and helped. The screws argued like old men, then relented. When I lifted the coil, a tiny ache bloomed in my wrist, the kind that says a thing has weight beyond ounces. In the space between my hands and the metal, the air prickled, same as last night, and I felt the stranger's tone from across the pasture. Faint, encouraging, like a friend clearing his throat in the back pew. On the way out, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Not a person, too smooth, a smear of color where color had no business, then a glint like a fish turning under ice. I stepped into the open anyway, because sneaking when you're only suspicious is a good way to teach a watcher your worst habits. Beyond the cottonwoods, the highway cut its indifferent seam across the day. A pickup rolled by, white county seal on the door, then didn't. It slowed, braked, and stopped just past my drive. Sheriff's Department. I stood where the creek path meets the yard and did an impression of a man with nothing to hide. A magpie complained from the fence post as if I'd parked in its spot. The truck idled. I imagined the conversation inside. Is he home? Is he the kind who calls, or the kind who makes pies go missing from windowsills? When the door opened, it wasn't the sheriff who got out. It was Deputy Lyle, new enough to use two hands when he writes in his notebook, young enough to think a clean shave is persuasive. "Mornin', Mr. Harrelson," he called, putting on friendliness like borrowed boots. "We had a couple reports of lights last night. Blue. Got any kids flying toys out here?" "Only kids on my property have 4 legs and eat hay," I said, hitching the coil up in both arms so it looked more like a chore and less like a relic. "Storm rattled the fence is all." He squinted at the coil, the way a non-farmer squints at anything that might be expensive. "What you got there?" "Pump coil," I said, trying to coax the south line into pretending it's spring. He nodded, which means nothing when a man doesn't know what he's nodding at. His gaze drifted toward the house, then to the barns, then, of course, to the cellar bulkhead, as if doors advertise. "Mind if I take a quick look around?" he asked. "Just due diligence." My heartbeat tried for double time, then corrected itself. I put my weight into the shape of a man who is tired of being reasonable. "You got a warrant for due diligence?" I asked, not unkindly, the way you ask a teenager if he has a reason for his tone. He blushed, which pleased me more than it should have. "No, sir, just neighborly." "Neighbors knock," I said. "They don't catalog." He adjusted his belt, a move deputies learn in the mirror. "Fair enough. If you hear or see something, you'll give us a ring." "Absolutely," I lied in the key of community. "If the aliens come for pie, I'll send 'em your way." He laughed the way boys laugh when their jokes are held at gunpoint. "Have a good one," he said, retreating. The truck idled a breath longer than necessary, then rolled on. I stayed where I was until the road swallowed the sound and gave me back the small noises my land makes when it thinks it's alone. Back inside, I set the coil on the kitchen table and listened. The house answered with its usual creaks. Beneath, the faintest thread of tone came up through the joists, a question wrapped in patience. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and opened the cellar to the cool that had learned to wait. "I've got it," I said, holding up the copper. The blue in the bruise brightened a fraction, then settled like a nod seen through water. The idea that landed in my mind had weight and sequence. Coil, wire, earth. A diagram without lines, only intentions. The tone added a fourth shape I hadn't expected. Boundary, not a wall, the suggestion of a circle drawn honestly. "You want a ground and a guard," I said. "A way to touch and a way to keep out." Agreement slid across my thoughts like a hand across linen. The cellar seemed to gather itself. Outside, a wind picked up, the kind that makes old houses hum with their own history. "We'll work in the barn," I decided. Less curious eyes, less straight lines. I gathered tools, a spool of wire, a length of rebar that had retired from something important, and looked once more at the stranger. The blue held true. The tone set a single note in the center of me. Now. Not urgent, precise. As I lifted the coil, the mark on my forearm warmed, the width of a ring I never wore, and for a heartbeat the air between us thickened again, the holy static of between. For the first time since the sky folded, I felt something like confidence. Not that I would succeed, but that the attempt had a place to belong. The barn has always been a cathedral pretending to be practical. High rafters that collect the weather, plank aisles that remember hooves. I chose the north bay, where the roof leaks only when it's sentimental, and rolled the big door just wide enough to swallow me and a secret. Dust rose in shafts like tired angels. The copper coil felt heavier than its metal, as if it had decided to be consequential. I laid tools on a feed bin and listened the way we had practiced, hands apart, breath even, mind turned slightly sideways to make room. The tone arrived from the house, a silver thread through old wood. Boundary, it reminded, earth. The word boundary didn't land as warning. It arrived like a line on a map that keeps a river from being paved over. Salt came to mind, not for superstition, for truth. It keeps corruption honest. It teaches water to remember itself. I found a half sack by the tack room, clumped from a summer of humidity, and split it open with a chisel. On the floor, I drew a circle as wide as my outstretched arms, rough but sincere. The salt hissed softly against the boards, a sound too small for ordinary ears and exactly the size of mine. In the center, I set the coil on a rubber mat. I ran car battery wire from its leads to a length of rebar I'd driven through a crack in the foundation, 3 feet down into the hungry dirt. I tightened the clamps the way you tighten promises. The free end I left bare to listen. The diagram in my head, coil, wire, earth, boundary, hung together like a sentence with no wasted words. When I touched the coil, the air between my hands and the metal lifted the hair on my wrists. The tone from the cellar brightened, still quiet, more present, like the stranger had turned its face toward the barn from the other side of a hill. I could feel its attention. I've known men to fake attention for a living. This wasn't that. This was presence at work. "Talk to me," I said, and the coil obeyed. Not with voice, never that, but with a hum just below hearing that found my bones and introduced itself. The fence outside answered an octave lower. The two tones regarded one another like dogs at a boundary, then settled into the polite distance of neighbors who have chosen peace. As I wrapped a few turns of spare copper around the coil's body, a poor man's secondary, the barn changed its mind about silence. Nails in the beams sang fractional. The straw whispered with a static that didn't need a storm, and the hanging halters began to sway on hooks that weren't on speaking terms with the breeze. A spider tethered between post and hayloft froze mid-step, then continued, resigning itself to physics adjusted. The tone thickened, not louder, denser, and the stranger poured a new shape into my head. The river again, but the banks this time were nearer. Stones rose like notes. 7 of them. I could feel where my foot belonged and where a misstep would send me into something that didn't forgive. Interval, it said, not unkindly. Approaches. The word didn't mean danger so much as don't be stupid. I eased the bare end of the wire toward the salt circle's edge. The moment copper crossed above the line, the barn brightened. Not with light, light was obedient to the hour, but with clarity. Edges got truer. My breath felt measured by a kinder meter. From the corner of my eye, the open door did something impossible. For a heartbeat, it was 2 doors, one where I'd left it, one 3 inches to the left, both valid, neither insisting. My stomach flipped the way it does when an elevator lies about its destination. I pulled the wire back. The second door vanished. The tone steadied, grateful, without need. "Okay," I said, because men narrate to keep their nerve. "We set the circle first, then we tune." I went slow. I'm old enough to know that slow is the speed of anything worth keeping. Each time I brought copper near the boundary, the coil and the fence found each other, tested harmonies, accepted some, refused others. I learned to recognize the false chords, the ones that made the rafters feel like a throat clearing to hide a cough, and the true ones, which made the air around my shoulders about 1 degree easier to carry. Halfway through, a presence pressed against the barn from the highway side. Not a person, a pressure. The way you know a big truck is coming around a bend, though you can't yet hear it. The horses in the south pasture raised their heads and chose stillness the way smart animals choose a high spot during rain. The tone in my skull thinned to a filament and touched my attention like a fingertip. Hold. So I held. I didn't move the wire. I didn't breathe more than a man must. Through the wide crack between door and frame, the daylight stepped aside for something that wasn't shadow, not exactly. An overlap, as if the day had remembered it had a second draft. The salt at my boots hissed louder, a sound like a fuse that never gets its way. The pressure reached the circle, tested it, decided we meant it, and withdrew without apology or offense. On the far fence, a magpie scolded, and then forgot why. I let air out of my lungs and laughed once, the sound of a jar easing its lid. "Boundary works," I said. "Neighbor," came the thought, corrected gently. Not wall. The image that arrived to explain it was ridiculous and perfect. 2 porches facing across an alley, clotheslines strung, a loaf passing hand to hand. Not distance. Respect. We tuned again. Slowly the coil's hum began to step the way the river had taught me. 1 stone, then the next. Then the third that sits a little too far and makes your calf complain. At the 4th placement, the barn did its 2-door trick again, only now I could see the 2nd door through rather than instead. For a blink, where the yard should be, there was a black river under a crowded sky, and a pier made of vertebrae gleaming with their own weather. The little craft was there, the choice traveling, and then it wasn't, as if my look had been too loud. The tone from the cellar braided with the coil, a chord I had no word for, settled in the space between my teeth and my spine. 5. The stranger sat down. Not a number for clocks, a step for feet that had learned the count. Behind that, a smaller idea, private and precise. You are hearing yourselves. The coil, the fence, the circle, the house, the animal hearts on this acre, my own included, had joined the tuning. We weren't summoning a thing. We were reminding the land how to sing in its own key so a traveler could pass by without paying with a crash. I tightened the last clamp and sat back on my heels. Outside, the wind changed its mind and carried the smell of snow that might never arrive. The coil's hum settled into patience. The salt held its line. The duplicate world, if that's what it was, folded itself responsibly away. I wiped my hands on my jeans and felt the warm ring on my forearm answer, as if a circle drawn in skin had nodded to the circle drawn in salt. From the cellar, the tone placed one final stone for the afternoon. Soon. Not urgent. Not a threat. A promise with a time signature. I closed the barn door to a hand's width, and for the first time since the sky bent, believed I might be equal to at least this much of the miracle. Evening took the temperature out of the day and left the shape of it. I closed the barn down to a slit and walked the coil's hum back to the house, like you walk a dog you're not sure will heal. The fields wore that hour's particular grey, neither surrender nor promise. At the porch, I paused to be a citizen, scanning for headlines in the ordinary, the road empty, the power lines calm, the magpie opinionated as ever. The world had decided to look normal in the way a poker face decides to be honest. In the cellar, the blue at the stranger's center had refined itself, not brighter, truer. The tone brushed my thoughts like a sleeve passing a shoulder in a narrow aisle. Progress, it set down. But the sense under it was less linear than that, more like a room remembering where its windows are. We tuned the barn, I said. No sparks, no sirens, a few extra doors. I tried to smile and felt it land skewed. Your river showed up like a postcard and then got shy. The tone answered in a chord, no bigger than a breath. Do not pursue carried itself along a thinner line. Allow. The word arrived with a picture simple enough for an old man, me on a dock, letting a boat tie itself. I nodded. There are things you ruin by asking them to hurry. We settled into the work night makes possible. I boiled water, the kettle whistling its modest news. I replaced the towel at the cellar jam because rituals keep the choices we've made from stealing each other's air. Then I did what any widower does when the world grows difficult. I cleaned. I wiped the workbench, sorted jars by the probably useless things they contained, stacked rags into a pile that had the decency to look temporary. The stranger watched. The tone tucked the smallest gratitude behind the ordinary, as if to say, I see what you're doing with your hands, so your heart doesn't have to be alone. The first shift came without warning. A nail on the stair stringer pinged once, a high, clean sound, as if tapped by a careful angel. The basement air cooled, then warmed, then chose the exact degree of a good handshake. A faint incense smell threaded the room, not church, not hospital, ozone softened by something like cedar. I closed my eyes and felt the floor tilt a hair to the left and back, as if the house was sighing into a better posture. When I opened them, the single bulb over the bench wore a thin halo that stayed whether I blinked or not. Is this the interval? I asked, suddenly aware that questions are louder than they feel. Approach, the thought returned, one of 7. The image that followed laid stones on the river again, but now I saw what had been hiding at the edges. The banks were not banks at all, but shoulders, and what I had called a current was more like a living spine arcing through a body I couldn't name. We weren't aligning a machine, we were easing a passage through someone's anatomy. The stranger's specific from last night found a new room in my understanding and switched on the light. Another ping. The bulb's halo tightened. In the ceiling, a hairline crack unlearned itself and smoothed over like time forgiving a small insult. At the high window, the rectangle of night doubled, one pane showing my backyard stubbled and polite, the other, a black water slowly lifting its own stars. I didn't turn my head. Turning your head is a way of shouting. The tone braided with the coil's far hum and the fence's old hymn until I couldn't tell which was which. Beneath them, something larger entered the conversation, something like bedrock deciding it would speak. It didn't arrive in sound or picture, but in a pressure you feel when a storm is honest, a recognition that you are small and not therefore useless. What are you really doing here? I asked softly, not to pry, but to be worthy of the moment. Not rescuing or invading, not evangelizing. So, what? The answer came as a humility that made me want to sit down. We correct. A pause. Then an elaboration kind enough for a man with my tools. Your world drifts in its sleep. Not much. Enough. We nudge. We listen until listening produces shape. We leave it truer than we found it. I thought of Ruth's hum, those unfinished tunes that taught our rooms their outlines, of fence posts you tap back to plumb because leaning invites storm. A maintenance of reality so delicate you call it myth, until you have a coil in a barn and the air begins to remember. And the reason you don't talk to us, I said, thinking of Mrs. Keating's careful eyes and Lyle's borrowed boots, isn't because we're fragile. Volatile, the tone confirmed with no pride at being right. You weaponize good news. You scale what should be local. You publish what should be sung. I took the rebuke like water, then smaller, closer, but you also repair. An image of my hands around the moth and the cigarette extinguished, placed side by side, until even I could tell which one carried the longer story. The third ping came through the joist like a plucked wire. This time, the double window didn't resolve quickly. In the other pane, a pier of vertebrae took on definition, struts flexing with a grace that wasn't mechanical. A vessel? No, a decision shaped like a vessel, slid alongside and paused. I felt it notice us, not target, not ignore. Notice the way you notice a child holding a door too heavy for him and adjust your pace so he believes he did it. The cellar light dimmed without losing light. The stranger's blue quieted to the sober glow of a pilot flame. 4. It set down with a care that made me wish I'd lived my whole life slower. The house held its posture. My skin ring warmed. In my mouth I tasted a coin's clean edge, and beneath it, snow that hadn't fallen yet. Do you need me for the crossing? I asked. I already knew the answer. I needed me for it. Witness, the thought returned first. Not admiring, accounting, anchor, next, small, local, honest. And then, like a benediction offered by a secular world, neighbor. Somewhere outside, a truck passed and did not interrupt us. The ordinary had learned to share. The fourth ping sounded like consent. I reached for the chair, pulled it closer, and set my palms an inch from the blue. I'll hold the between, I said, a sentence so strange it fit. You take the river. The tone settled in my bones like a well-laid joist. The window's second pane held steady, not demanding, just available. In it, the craft unlatched from the pier as gently as a hand leaving another hand, and the house, and the fence, and the coil, and the animal hearts of this acre remembered their note together. That was when I understood the purpose wasn't arrival. It was tuning a goodbye that could return. The fifth ping arrived the way dawn does, by convincing everything else to make room. It threaded the joists and sat behind my eyes like a patient star. The cellar bulb dimmed again without surrendering sight, and the blue at the stranger's center narrowed to a pin as bright as a welder's arc viewed through closed lashes. I set my palms out, a handspan from the glow, and felt the air gather itself between them the way a horse gathers before a jump. Coil, judge, go. Easy, I whispered, to it or to the house or to the part of me that wanted to look away. We hold. We don't, I searched for a word, insist. The window's second pane deepened until it had its own horizon. In that other rectangle, the river did not shine. It received light, as if the sky were a kindness it could admit. Along its bank, the vertebrae pier flexed in a rhythm that belonged to seasons I had never met. The vessel, no hull, no engine, the size of a decision one person can make without permission, eased forward, keeping time with a measure I couldn't count and recognized anyway. My breath copied it. The house copied me. The fence outside, which has always had opinions, agreed. 5. The tone set gently. Not a tally, an arrival at a note that made the previous ones make sense. Then another sound lodged in my teeth. Not a ping this time, something lower and older, like bedrock, remembering a promise. The coil in the barn answered. The salt circle held. Above us, in the winter-thin evening, the power lines took a respectful half-step back. The sixth came as a correction, not a strike. A hairline quiver touched the air and straightened before fear could spend itself. The lamp's halo spread and thinned, and in that bright lace I saw, for the length of a heartbeat, the shape of a hand that wasn't a hand, hovering over the stranger's chest. My hands offset as if the room were rehearsing me from another angle. The ring of warmth on my forearm heated to the exact temperature of a memory you honor without letting it break you. Anchor, the tone reminded, kind but not indulgent. Witness, neighbor. I didn't nod. Nods allowed. The seventh didn't arrive. It assembled. Nails in timber found a pitch and agreed. Dust motes aligned as if listening were a wind. The magpie on the south fence shut up. Outside, a long truck downshifted and then changed its mind, as if the road itself had asked politely. In the other pane, the vessel reached the first stone and became thinner without getting smaller. Not transparency, specificity, a thing shaped exactly like what it was for. It kissed the second stone, then the third that sits too far and requires more of your calf than pride permits. And at each touch, something in my chest unknotted that I hadn't noticed was tied. I'm here, I said, not to be useful, but to be accurate. The stranger's blue contracted once more, then opened like a pupil taking an honest measure of night. Its knot face tilted toward me. The tone, ours, not its, rose a fraction, and I felt the coils hum braid with the fence and the house into a single, sober chord that wanted nothing, boasted nothing, and would remember forever. The vessel moved to the fourth stone and paused. Not hesitation, calibration. A wind I couldn't feel decided to change directions. Without thinking, I splayed my fingers. The space between my hands tightened as if the world had politely asked it to. The fifth stone took the weight, then the sixth. On the seventh, there was no step. There was an understanding, the kind you don't put into words, because doing so would make them smaller than the thing that taught them to exist. The vessel continued without continuing. The pane held a river that was also a spine, that was also a path, through a patient body I would never own enough names for. Something touched my chest then, not pressure, permission. The blue at the stranger's center unhooked from its housing the way a moth lets go of a porch screen and trusts the dark to be generous. It did not fly, it translated. One breath it was here, balanced between my two old hands. The next, it was precisely where the vessel had been, as if the river had realized it had been waiting for a passenger that made sense. The knot face turned, not toward me, but through me, and I understood I had never been the address, only the porch light left on. I wanted to say thank you, and don't, and please, and stay, and go, and tell them we're trying. The words lined up and couldn't agree on an order. The tone saved me. It set a single syllable in the quiet, a sound I could not pronounce but could keep, and the meaning of it was enough. The pane thinned back to glass. The river took its stars and minded its business. The lamp forgot it had ever worn a halo and went on with its humble work. In the barn, the coil downshifted to a hum the mice could nap through. Salt lay white and ordinary on old boards. My hands hovered in air that remembered me. I lowered them. The room did not collapse. It had learned a better way to be itself and saw no reason to brag. Where the stranger had rested, the blanket held an impression no heavier than a promise kept. On the workbench, 3 flecks of silver dust arranged themselves into a curve and then became just dust again. My forearm cooled and did not forget. I waited for grief and received something stranger, relief without victory. The feeling that comes when a bridge you helped hold stops needing you and no one falls. Upstairs, the refrigerator kicked on like a dog, clearing its throat to say it's still part of the family. Far off, the highway took back its bravado. I climbed to the kitchen and leaned both hands on the sink. Out the window, the yard was only yard, the fence only fence. And in the field where the sky had once folded itself for me, a thin blue hung where the horizon pretends to end. It pulsed once, no more than the ascent friends give each other from across crowded rooms, and was gone in the decent way true things go. Not slamming doors, not leaving notes, trusting you to remember. In the quiet after, a last tone arrived. The size of a breath laid in my pocket. Soon, it said, and I knew it didn't mean a return. It meant again, the kind of soon that belongs to seasons and chores and whatever work keeps a world true. I turned off the cellar light and felt the house stand a little straighter. "All right," I said to the floorboards and the fence and the space between my hands. "We'll hold the note." The morning after, the house woke before I did. Joists settled the way a back remembers good posture. The refrigerator's old rattle had turned into a purr you could trust. Even the clock over the sink ticked with a cleaner intent, as if the second hand had negotiated a better contract with time. I lay there listening to an ordinary that had learned manners. The cellar was empty in the way a chapel's empty, used, not abandoned. The blanket kept the shape of a promise for one more hour and then forgot, kindly. The air still held the faintest smell of soft ozone and cedar, like a handshake between storm and wood. On the bench, the 3 specks of silver dust refused to be meaningful. I let them be dust. I took the coil out to the barn and unwound our small miracle with the patience it had taught me. Salt I swept up into a coffee can, set the lid on, but not tight, because finality is a story people tell when they're tired. The rebar stayed in the earth. It had earned the right to remain useful. When I lifted the rubber mat, the boards beneath were warmer than they had any reason to be, as if a very polite sun had passed through while the doors were shut. Nothing dramatic announced itself. The fence did not glow. The sky did not rename the color blue on my account. Still, there were differences, the sort you notice when you've lived alone long enough to know what a room sounds like when you breathe in it. The horses stood easier at their hay, like the night had smoothed out an argument they'd been having with gravity. The poplars didn't chatter at every breeze. They considered, then spoke. Out by the south gate, the padlock that always stuck surrendered on the first try, as if metal were a citizen again. My forearm kept its warm ring until noon, then cooled to a stern memory. I caught myself rubbing the spot the way you check your pocket for keys you already know you don't have. The habit will fade, the shape will stay. Around 11, Mrs. Keating's sedan made the driveway choose humility. She stood on the porch with a Tupperware of soup, the lid as tight as her questions. "Carrot and ginger," she said, "for circulation or consolation, whichever you're short on." "I'm rich in both, thanks to you," I said, and meant it. We drank coffee at my table and talked like good neighbors do when both suspect a third thing is in the room and agree not to feed it. She reported on the coyote with more nerve than brains, her son with more opinions than time, the post office with less of both. I offered the weather and a fence post story that wasn't about fences. When she left, she put her hand over mine, an old woman's brief benediction, and said, "If you ever need help carrying nothing, I'm across the road." Deputy Lyle did his second drive-by that afternoon, the county seal trying to look confident on a sun-faded door. He paused at the end of the lane, reconsidered, and kept going. I was grateful he didn't knock. I was, strangely, also ready if he did. I had the ordinary prepared. Generator trouble, coyotes, drafts, words like sandbags, decent and dull. I slept that night in the chair by the cellar door, not because I expected company, but because the chair had learned my shape and I had learned its. Dream came as a river that was also a path, that was also the long spine of a sleeping thing I owe some portion of my breath to. I did not cross. I tended the bank. I woke with a smile small enough to keep. In the days that followed, the world kept offering tiny proofs that repair can be quiet. A split in the porch rail, closed enough to stop catching sleeves. The weakest of my 3 porch bulbs, a habitual flickerer, chose a steadier vocation. I tuned the old radio out in the shed and landed on stations I hadn't caught in years. Farm reports with deadpan poetry, gospel sung by people who don't need microphones, a hockey game called by a man who loves vowels. The sound came clearer when my left hand hovered an inch above the dial. I took the hint and didn't go looking for meaning that wasn't mine. I wrote in a yellow notebook I once reserved for feed numbers and Ruth's medication schedule. Not for the internet, not for a publisher, just the truth arranged in the order I could bear it. I wrote down the chord we made, fence and coil and house and animal hearts, so that if I grew old in a way that forgets, the paper could be neighbor to the man I had been. I wrote, "You are not fragile, you are volatile," and under it, "Be local, repair, hold the between." At the bottom of the page, I drew a ring the width of my mark and closed the book. Sometimes, just before sleep, a small tone finds the bones around my ears. Not loud, not needy. It doesn't say soon. It says again, the way a season says it to the field it returns to, because both remember their arrangement. I don't go to the window every time. When I do, the horizon is exactly where it was yesterday. Once, just once, I saw a thin blue hanging there, pulsing with the patient courtesy of a friend who knows your bedtime. I haven't told anyone, not really. If Mrs. Keating asked, I would tell her the part about the soup. If Lyle pressed, I'd tell him the part about the coil and leave out the river, because some stories belong to the joints of a house and the quiet of a man who knows which doors are also hinges. Maybe someday a storm will fold itself into my field again. If it does, the rebar is still in the ground, the salt is in a coffee can, and I have a chair that fits. Before bed, I do the small maintenance a keeper of notes does. I oil the gate latch. I tap the fence post that's listing toward temptation. I hum a tune of Ruth's into rooms that remember us. I set my palms an inch apart and feel the air answer, just enough to confirm the contract. What remains is not wonder or fear, so much as a responsibility that weighs less than it looks. I'm a witness with chores, a neighbor to things that don't need names to be true. In a volatile world, I can be specific. I can keep the porch light on without telling the whole county to come stare at the door. Tonight, the house stands a little straighter. The clock does its honest work. Somewhere beyond the wheat, a river I will never own keeps the promise we helped it keep. I lay my hands in the space between and hear the note we learned to hold. And I say, for the last time out loud and the first time forever, all right, I've got the between.